My name is Miroslav Wolf, and I'm the director of Yale Center for Faith and Culture. I want to welcome all of you to this inaugural Sarah Smith Conference on Moral Leadership. Now, the word inaugural contains a promise. We are starting here something of which there is more, hopefully, to come. On an annual basis, we at the Yale Center of Faith and Culture will organize conferences which identify some of the major moral issues that concern us all and explore the resources that our faith traditions provide for addressing them. In addition to ongoing programs such as ethics and spirituality in the workplace and shorter-term projects such as faith as a way of life, Sarah Smith Conferences on Moral Leadership will be one way in which we at Yale Center for Faith and Culture are seeking to fulfill our mission. And our mission is to promote the practice of faith in all spheres of life through theological reflection and leadership development. I'm delighted that all of you are here to help us kick off this ongoing series of conferences on moral leadership. As our mission statement says, we're interested in all spheres of life. Our conference is therefore interdisciplinary. You will find speakers from politics and media, as well as from business and academia, and within academia from such diverse fields as journalism, economics, philosophy, and theology. You as participants also represent different spheres of life and are therefore familiar with different leaders of those respective disciplines. After looking at our brochure, one businessman said, "Wow, you got Eric Pillmore to speak at your conference. But who's Jürgen Moltmann?" One student of theology told me, "I cannot wait to hear Moltmann speak, but who's Phil Lader?" If you're in politics or business, you'll know who Phil Lader is. If you're in philosophy, you'll know who Baroness O'Neill is. And so it is with all of our distinguished speakers. We wanted the conference to be a site where diverse fields would intersect and bring their own wisdom, informed by our faith traditions, on issues that concern essential dimension of moral leadership in our changing world. For our first conference, we have chosen the theme of trust, crisis of trust, trust in a culture of suspicion as spin. That is the title of our conference. We will all agree, I think, about the extraordinary importance of trust in our individual lives and culture as a whole. Without trust, you would not be here. You trusted transportation means to get you to Prospect Street in New Haven, and you trusted us that we'd put up an event worthy of your time. Without trust, we would not have organized this conference. I trusted my co-workers, we together trusted our speakers, and we trusted that we rightly assessed that the topic of trust would be of wider interest. Your trust and our trust was hopefully an informed and even, to use a phrase from Baroness O'Neill, intelligent trust. But it was trust nonetheless. Trust is central to all our endeavors, to our families, our democracy, our economy, indeed, our whole culture and every single one of us in it. We could not function without trust. We are here because trust matters to us. But we don't organize major conferences on all things that matter to us. We don't even talk much about them unless they are in some way threatened. Major scandals in religion, business, politics, and academia in recent years, all of which involve some form of betrayal of trust, are an indicator of an erosion of trust in contemporary societies. An important component of our cultural capital seems to be at risk, and we are left with many questions. How do we restore trust after it has been destroyed by greed and thoughtlessness? How do we create relationships that generate and sustain trust rather than undermine it? Are some forms of trust bad, such as blind trust? And if so, how do we discourage bad trust without undermining good trust? What is the relationship between trust and trustworthiness? How is trust as a religious phenomenon, how is trust in God, above all, related to our mundane trusts? Trust in ourselves, trust in each other, and trust in our institutions. These are some of the questions we intend to explore in the course of this conference. But before we start this journey through the maze of questions that concern trust, I want to introduce to you our team at Yale Center for Faith and Culture, who have worked so diligently and competently to prepare this conference. I want first the staff to stand up, and you will recognize them by them wearing kind of lavender T-shirts with a Yale Center for Faith and Culture logo on them. Let's see, only you, Heather? Where are the rest of you? The others seem to be working, huh? If you have any questions, if you have any concerns, and you see somebody wearing a lavender T-shirt with Yale Center for Faith and Culture logo, tag them, get to them. They'll try to help you, and if they don't know how to help you, they'll try to find somebody who can help you. I also want to introduce to you David Miller, my most immediate co-worker at the Center for Faith and Culture. David teaches here at YDS at School of Management Business Ethics, but his primary responsibility is as executive director of the center. And David, please stand up. Most of you will know David. David is extraordinary in what he does and a great friend to have. None of this would have happened without his efforts. And now it is my pleasure to invite the Dean of Yale University Divinity School and Lillian Klaus, Professor of New Testament, Harry Attridge, to greet you. He has been a great supporter of our work at the Yale Center for Faith and Culture in general and of this conference in particular. Harry Attridge.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be with you tonight, and it really is an example of the kind of trust that our colleagues pose in a dean to invite him to the podium. So this is a good sign for what is going to come. It's really been a great time during the course of the last year and a half when we've brought this Center for Faith and Culture into being. Miroslav and David and Chris and the rest of the staff of the center have done a wonderful job of putting this program together, and it's really a stellar cast of people who are going to be with us this weekend, including some old friends like my sailing buddy from Notre Dame days, Ollie Williams, and other people who are no strangers to our institution, like Baroness O'Neill. So I'm delighted to have you all with us, and I welcome you all to this conference and welcome you all to the Divinity School if you haven't been here before, and I hope we'll see you back. It's my pleasure tonight not only to welcome you, but to introduce the person who will introduce our speaker, and that is my colleague and my boss. Now, is this an example of trust or what? Barbara Shaler, who is the Deputy Provost for the Arts and Divinity, a distinguished scholar in her own right, a medievalist who has worked on the history of manuscripts and early books, who is a specialist in the manuscripts of Beatus, a commentator on the Apocalypse, a really interesting medieval figure, I must say. Barbara Shaler is with us tonight, having done a stint down at the University of Virginia this summer precisely on that subject. Isn't that right? Yeah. It's been a delight to work with Barbara during the course of the last couple of years. I really enjoy reporting to her. Trust me on that one. And I'm happy to introduce her to you tonight.
Thank you, Harry. I'm privileged to be able to introduce our keynote speaker this evening and also to begin my remarks by remembering the woman to whose life and lay ministry this conference series has been dedicated. Sarah Smith, 1941 to 99, had a passion for moral leadership, which she exemplified through her own activities. A graduate of the Yale Divinity School, she traveled across the country speaking, presenting seminars, and conducting retreats. A devout Methodist, she served in several roles locally in Connecticut, nationally, and internationally, and was selected as Layperson of the Year by the Council of Churches and Synagogues. Yale is honored to be able to host this series of conferences beginning this fall to foster moral leadership in all spheres of life and thus to honor Sarah Smith's memory. And I know that there are several members of her family and her friends here this evening, and I would like them to stand and be recognized for their generous spirit and in memory of Sarah Smith. So if you would, please. It is also most appropriate that this series is sponsored by the Center for Faith and Culture, a center that grew out of a comprehensive Yale self-study of the Yale Divinity School. And as in most institutions of higher education, we love self-studies. This is something that we do constantly. For centuries, the Yale Divinity School has been known for its academic excellence and for the preeminence of its faculty, its students, and the national church leaders educated here. This self-study recognized, though, that the Divinity School was not sufficiently engaging either a broader public audience or looking consciously to guide the future reality. The center is an outgrowth of this realization and represents a significant initiative of the Divinity School's ongoing commitment to play a crucial role in moral leadership. We begin this inaugural symposium this evening with a speaker who is truly well-positioned to examine the issue of trust, and I put that all in capital letters. And he is certainly positioned from many, many different points of view and perspectives. Philip Lader has held leadership positions in critical times of moral tension, and some would even say times of moral decay. As former ambassador to the Court of St. James, he's experienced firsthand the difficulties of diplomacy and politics in an uncertain world. As an executive in a worldwide communications firm, and before that in a very successful real estate development company, he has faced the challenges of public perceptions that are often wary of the media and large business enterprises. As an often appointed administrator within the United States government, he has been part of a mammoth bureaucracy that continues to struggle with tough ethical dilemmas in law, finance, the workplace, the environment. And as the founder of Renaissance Weekends, the retreats for leaders from many countries and backgrounds, he and his wife Linda have created a venue for the exploration of ideas fundamentally essential for a peaceful and enlightened global community. Without reciting any of his academic credentials, which are considerable, or as well, an even more lengthy list of awards and honors that have been bestowed upon him, please join me in welcoming Ambassador Philip Lader for this keynote address. Thank you.
Barbara neglected to mention one thing. After 8 years in government, I just feel blessed not to have been indicted and still be employable. I don't know about you, but I've always considered Miroslav to be very trustworthy, never exaggerating. But then when I hear him make reference to the topic of faith as a way of life, as a Yale Divinity School short-term project, I'm rather confused. Well, wondering, probably as you are, what this businessman is doing on this program amidst the conference's stellar other speakers. I have to tell you, I do question David and Nadine, the convener's judgment, much as I did in one of my early days at the embassy in London. I was invited on St. George's Day by the St. George's Society to be the speaker at their annual meeting celebrating their patron saint. And the topic they assigned me was what it means to be an Englishman. But I have to tell you, being U.S. Ambassador to the Court of St. James is one of the best jobs in the world. Will Rogers once said that you only have one responsibility. That's to give one speech a year on July 4th, but to leave the British with the impression that they really won. I never quite pulled that off, and I hope I can do better tonight. But here I am, a commoner in the company of one of the world's foremost theologians and the celebrated authority on philosophy and member of the House of Lords. So to prepare, I asked David, when I learned that the Center on Faith and Culture had asked all of you who had registered to express your expectations for the conference, for him to let me see what you said. And I have to tell you, you were very explicit. Let me give you an example, and I quote from several cards. Broader understanding of the way institutions and their leaders deal with complex issues relating to trust. Expand my grasp of the issue of trust and ethics in the public square. I love this one. Explore how disciplines outside of those directly influenced by psychology understand the term trust and how that relates to the discipline of moral inquiry. Obviously, there's some serious thinkers here. I've read and heard so much about Baroness O'Neill and Professor Moltmann. Foster moral leadership in all spheres of life through theological research. I want to meet Moltmann. To gain a vocabulary of hope for my congregation to enhance our understanding of cultural distrust. To see Baroness O'Neill, Gus Niebuhr, Oliver Williams, and Eric Pillmore. To learn more about bioethics, about Baroness O'Neill. I want to hear O'Neill and Moltmann. You see why I'm totally baffled why I'm here? I have to tell you, I've learned to take recognition in any form you can get it. When I presented my credentials in 1997 in London, Her Majesty, as her custom, did something wonderful in our memory. She sent these 2 horse-drawn, red, gilt carriages to pick us up at the embassy. And there we were, my wife in her expensive new hat, and I in white tie and tails, a uniform for the occasion, being driven in this horse-drawn carriage through the streets of London for a half an hour. And we could see people looking, saying, who are these people? But then we got to the corner. And you know the corner I'm speaking of. And as we turned into Buckingham Palace, I don't mean, Barbara, to be immodest, but there were about 1,000 people there, waving and cheering. Now, they were there for the changing of the guard, but we waved back anyway. So I hope you might be so kind as to give me the same benefit of the doubt tonight. But in fact, any genuine credentials that I might have once proved an impediment to a very important transaction. When I was first notified that I'd have the privilege of representing our country in London, my wife and our elder daughter were thrilled. My younger daughter, then 9, was frankly pretty upset, leaving her friends, leaving her school. So I did what I suspect every male in this audience typically has done to get a child to go along. I tried bribery. And I said, you know that dog you've been wanting? If you really go along with this, we'll get you the dog. But we discovered that the official residence was to be closed for 2 years for renovations. And the government leased a very nice house for us, but in that lease was, you can guess, a prohibition against pets. But kids never forget. So 2 years later, we're about to move into the official residence, and Whitaker says, Dad, you remember that promise? But Linda had discovered that the official residence, as some of you know, Kingman Brewster having been one of my predecessors, as you know, is filled with extraordinary antiques. It's not exactly the place for a frisky puppy. But Linda suggested, why don't we get a dog that has just barely failed the examination to be a seeing eye dog? So I called what in Britain is called the Guide Dogs for the Blind. And for 5 months, my conversation with the executive director of Guide Dogs for the Blind ended with her telling me, Mr. Ambassador, I regret to inform you that we have not yet found a dog that matches your psychological profile. Now, I mean, was it because I'm an American, because I worked for the government? I don't know. But we moved into the house, and a few weeks later, my secretary runs in and says, "You've got to take this call. It's that woman from the guide dogs." And the executive director says, "Mr. Ambassador, we have found the perfect dog for you, but you must come immediately for the interview." Now, I thought I was going to interview the dog. When I showed up, the executive director wasn't there, and the staffer didn't have a clue what my job might be. And so the interview went like this. She holds a clipboard. "Philip, are you employed?" "Yes." "Who is your employer?" "The United States government." "Are you paid weekly?" I guess she's worried about our government's cash flow. "No, monthly." "Do you own a home in London?" "No." "Do you rent a house?" "Sort of." "Is your house large enough for a dog?" "I think so." "How large is this house?" 36 rooms. "Where is your house?" "Central London, Regent's Park." "Oh, I'm sorry. We require that our dogs go to houses that have a garden." "Do you have a garden large enough for a dog?" "I think so." "How large is this garden?" 16 acres. "Sir, I must ask you, what is your salary?" And I told her my salary as a U.S. ambassador. She turned white. "Sir, I don't know how to say this, but do you really think with that income you can continue to maintain this lifestyle?" And the answer was obviously no. But somehow I passed the exam, and a frisky Shakespeare named by our daughters came to live at Winfield House. Well, the conference asks, as Miroslav said, a crisis of trust. But doesn't everyone trust in trust? Every time we cross a bridge, board a flight, send a child off to school, step in an elevator, send a check, hire a new pastor, or take a pill. Trust underlies all the routines of ordinary life. Even if the notion "in God we trust" is under challenge, certainly in trust we trust. So perhaps everyone knows as much about the subject as anyone on the conference program. There's no doubt, however, that trust for Americans today is less instinctive, that we find ourselves in what the conference terms a culture of suspicion and spin. WorldCom, mutual fund scandals, Swift boat and National Guard allegations. In the sports pages, a star athlete nears a record amidst questions about how he got there. In airports, we're frisked. Our fingernail clippers, contraband. It's not surprising when a Time magazine cover asks, "Who can we trust?" Well, others are better able to address the dimensions of trust in religious faith. Let me simply observe, from my own experiences in business and government, that trust in the public square also is indispensable. Lest this seem too secular an approach for a divinity school context, I must tell you that when I asked a librarian and subsequently the reference desk at Barnes & Noble what they had on trust, both responded, "You mean wills and trusts?" And when I said no, the quick rejoinder from each of them was, "Then you must want something about government and business." This shouldn't be surprising. We all know many congregations that are centered, even in the names themselves, on faith or on hope. Faith Chapel, Hope Community Church. But I don't remember ever seeing a Trust Cathedral or Trust Ministries. I mean, it's banks that are called Fiduciary Trust or Trust Company of the West. Social Security and Medicare have trust funds. 7 million readers have purchased Rick Warren's The Purpose-Driven Life. And they and their families have therein considered the biblical concept of life itself as a trust. Luther, Tillich, Merton, Martin Marty, scores of our favorite writers on religion have written about trust. Yet the word trust is more commonly associated with issues of the pocketbook than, frankly, with matters of the heart. The legal concept of trust was introduced into England shortly after the Norman Conquest. Its definition in the law is that of, and I'll be tedious here, a fiduciary relationship in which one person is the holder of the title to property, subject to an equitable obligation to keep or use the property for the benefit of another. Now, this concept, of course, has to employ documents, signatures, bonds. It was long ago said by an English lawyer that the parents of the trust were fraud and fear, and the court of conscience was its nurse. Would we today say that the underminers of trust are suspicion and spin, and the courts of conscience, CNN and Fox News? Is what we see what we get? That's where the title of my lecture tonight, which is The Great Steak and Kidney Pie Dilemma, comes in. Jeremy Bullmore, a wise friend in his 70s, former head of J. Walter Thompson in London, one of our agencies, tells of his visit to a new farm shop recently opened in Wiltshire countryside. The old barn had been converted to a convincing farmer's market, like you have around here, with broad beams and a stripped wooden floor, fruits and vegetables displayed in wicker baskets, daily specials hand-lettered on a blackboard. The place absolutely reeked of authenticity, he said. Here's how he tells it. The homemade steak and kidney pie looked particularly appetizing, so we bought one, had it for supper that evening. The steak inside the pie was meagerly distributed and far from tender. My wife found 2 small pieces of kidney. I found none. To many of us English, he continues, the steak and kidney pie is the embodiment of authentic, basic country food. No factory, we think, could ever replicate its rich abundance, its melting, meaty generosity. And now here, having inflated our hopes and expectations, was this mean-spirited apology for a pie, this mockery of a pie, this shameless rip-off imposter of a pie. And the fact that we had bought it from a converted barn with stripped wooden floors made its duplicity doubly offensive. We have not patronized that farm shop since. The simulated authentic farm store's sizzle, we might say, was no different from Enron's numbers or this month's campaign promises. The skimpiness of steak was, to Jeremy, a breach of trust. The absence of kidney, even worse. That's what, in my mind, presents us with what, in the next 30 minutes, I'll explain as the great steak and kidney pie dilemma we face. We might argue that Jeremy shouldn't have been so gullible, influenced by the contrived spick and span country barn. That this is how the world works. That in business today, more than ever, buyer beware. Probably no industry has been accused of creating a spin culture more than advertising. Failures of corporate governance, witness WorldCom and Tyco, the current Hollinger matter, have fueled the environment of suspicion. Let me consider, therefore, for my own observations, as I was asked to do, first as chairman of a global marketing services company with 1,400 offices in 106 countries that has developed and maintained some of the world's most trusted brands though I'm not an advertising man. And second, as a director of several global companies, how trust is being addressed and hopefully restored in these realms. Now, why should the notion of brands be considered in a chapel? It's been observed that in contemporary America, there's greater trust in some brands than in religion. Not surprising in a nation, however religious, where each week more people go to Walmart than to church. Perhaps there's something to be learned from the legacy of Elmer Wheeler. That salesman of the Depression proclaimed, "Sell the sizzle, not, the steak." What he meant, of course, was to promote the benefits, the excitement, not an inventory of the product's ingredients or attributes. Nothing necessarily to distrust here. But then Vance Packard came along with, as some of you will remember, in the 50s, The Hidden Persuaders, one of the best-known books in advertising. So it wasn't really about advertising. And that made us very suspicious. He wrote about manipulation. The culprits, what were then called motivational researchers. Were consumers actually being reduced to morons, seduced by subliminal messages that, as we later learned, may never have been there, to spend money that they did not have for goods that they did not want? Two of those motivational researchers, in a 1955 Harvard Business Review article, saved us from the obnoxious, loud, mindless commercials of our baby boomers' childhoods. Do you remember the repetitive New Ipana toothpaste jingle? Many of you aren't old enough to. But the case was made in this article for brands and brand advertising based on the genuine attributes of products. The legendary David Ogilvy, and as well as our friend Jeremy, both important contributors to the thinking about brands, convinced the industry that advertising's principal role is not necessarily to persuade people to change their attitudes, but to generate publicity for brands, to maintain and increase the brand's salience and celebrity. Advertisers spend significant sums because brands have to stand out. The bigger the size of a brand's user base, the stronger the brand. What if this applies to the Yale brand, to the Starbucks brand, the Kennedy, Dole, Clinton, Bush family brands, to a denominations brand, to this Divinity School's brand? How do you cope with hundreds of soups and scores of cereals, not to mention all the kinds of chicken and beef, staring at you from the supermarket shelf? Professor Barry Schwartz, in his book, The Paradox of Choice, observed that faced with choices of unmanageable complexity, we all have to delegate, sometimes consciously, sometimes instinctively. The general and the CEO, while leading tens of thousands, have a small number of officers reporting to them. The consumer, making choices, also looks to trusted lieutenants, to which shopping choices can be delegated, and those are the brands. To compete with generics and often lower prices, the brands must earn and retain trust. Some products, institutions, candidates, incredibly adept at spin, still get pretty far just on sizzle. Was the selling of the president written about 1968 or campaign 2004? Will consumers, students, voters demand more steak in their steak and kidney pie? Authentic authenticity, Jeremy calls it. His postscript was this: all the farm shop's energy and investment had been expended on the sizzle. That, they believed, was all the punters cared about. But he offers a note of encouragement. as choice continues to multiply, we'll continue to delegate more, and we'll put our trust only in trustworthy names of demonstrable intrinsic quality. The sizzle will still get our nostrils flaring with anticipation. But he says, if we're ever cheated of the steak and kidney again, we'll be vindictive till the end of time. Precisely because of today's culture of suspicion and spin, tomorrow's most enduring brands are likely to be those which are most trusted. But is the same trend apparent in corporate governance? As Enron, WorldCom, and Tyco scandals unfolded, with felony indictments, the collapse of a prestigious accounting firm, and huge personal pension fund losses, trust in business, we all know, further evaporated. Shareholders, citizens, and Congress looked for the stake in corporate governance. And suspicion here has led to redefinition of the role of independent directors, tougher practices in audit firms, and the Sarbanes-Oxley legislation. Though such malfeasance was found in only a handful of public companies, restoration of trust has been sought across the board. The requirement that chief executives themselves sign off on corporate financial reports probably attracted the most attention, but broad-scale and costly corporate governance changes have been implemented. New standards of risk analysis, exhaustive financial control mechanisms, mandatory independence of the board's audit and nominations committee members, simply to reference a few. Some American corporations have adopted the British model of separating the roles of chairman and chief executive, which I strongly endorse. Boardroom debates continue to rage about the considerable costs and possibly exaggerated benefits of such requirements. Have the federal legislation and aggressive state attorneys general gone just too far? Is entrepreneurial energy being sapped by legalistic box ticking? And perhaps more relevant to many of you, why should nonprofits be exempt from such rigorous scrutiny? As a result of these reforms, transparency and accountability, no doubt, are now greater. Spin more difficult, suspicion reduced. Yet once again, trust depends on people. The ultimate safeguard of shareholder interests is not the systemic reforms, but trust in the directors and executives and managers down the line. To illustrate, when I worked in the 1980s for the Anglo-French financier Sir James Goldsmith, who had acquired Brown, Zellerbach, and Diamond International, amongst other major companies, I reported as an executive vice president then to the chief executive, Al Dunlap, who later came to be known as Chainsaw Al after publication of his autobiography, Mean Business. Nothing that I saw during those years violated the law. And Al and I, with contrasting philosophies about most issues, got along well personally. But the fundamental premise of our respective views of business led to profoundly different conclusions. He believed that the enterprise's objective must be the maximization of shareholder return in the short term. Well, I believe that the goal should be the optimization of shareholder return in a realistic midterm. This is not an academic issue when a forestry company's trees are to be cut or industrial plants in small towns might be closed. Neither view necessarily is right, but they certainly lead to different conclusions. And I still hold that my preference is necessary to maintain a trust relationship with the company's stakeholders. And that trust relationship will, in the medium and long term, be in the shareholders' financial interest. Now, non-financial observers of advertising and corporate governance may deem my reflections too nuanced, but I'm heartened by my own observations. Just consider this statement in a large electric utility company's annual report this year. It reads, "Trust is at the heart of our relationships with our customers. Trust means doing what we say, acting with integrity, respecting and empowering our employees. Building trust is essential to strong future relationships with our stakeholders." I suspect there were few statements like that in the corporate annual reports of the 1980s and 90s. And I wish our political parties got it that well. In the past several decades, confidence in almost all American institutions, corporations, journalism, medicine, even universities, has been eroded. But few would dispute the especially precipitous and continuous decline of trust in government. When President Bush and Senator Kerry were at Yale, 3/4 of the American public believed government would customarily do the right thing. More recent polls indicate that the corresponding number has dropped to 25%. What didn't we ask about Vietnam, about the Kennedys, about the best and the brightest? How much more has changed since the naive black and white television Eisenhower era? My friend Jim Rogers, whom some of you know, the investment manager who has circumnavigated the globe on a motorbike, went to Yale in those days. On his first Sunday, a true story he loves to tell, on his first Sunday in New Haven, he tried to call home. He told the operator that he came from a small town in Alabama, Demopolis. "Okay, what's your phone number?" she asked. 5. 5 what? "Just 5, ma'am." "You mean 555-5555? "No, ma'am," he said politely. "Just 5. This got her mad. "Are you one of those college kids?" "Yes, ma'am." "I don't have to take this from a Yaley. What's the real number, boy?" Well, finally persuaded that he wasn't being disrespectful, the Connecticut operator back then had to connect with the New York operator, first with the Connecticut operator, who connected with the New York operator, then to the Atlanta operator, and finally to the Birmingham operator, who got through to the Demopolis operator on the phone. The New Haven operator spoke first. "I've got one of these college kids on the line, and he's trying to tell me that he's trying to call a number 5 in Demopolis, Alabama." Without missing a beat, the Demopolis operator said, "Oh, tell Jimmy his parents aren't home. They're at church right now." Our world is very different. But why is government so commonly now deemed untrustworthy? Money, as always, is part of the explanation. How campaign funds are raised and spent, where appropriations go, how public assets are misused and tax-exempt status abused. Yet the answer is more complex than mere corruption, waste, fraud, and abuse. You asked me to tell some personal anecdotes. Having worked side by side with Vice President Gore on the National Performance Review when I was at the Office of Management and Budget, I can personally attest that while there's ample evidence of such problems, the public suspicion is a great exaggeration of the scale of such misdeeds. We examined the major federal agencies in exhaustive detail, assisted by inspectors general, line managers, whistleblower 800 numbers, and stacks of government accounting office reports, in an effort to make the federal government work better and cost less. Results included reduction of the civilian workforce by more than 250,000 positions to the level of the Kennedy administration 3 decades before. Financial management and procurement reforms, and elimination of reams and reams of regulations. But the consequent savings are minuscule compared with the costs of poorly designed programs, and yes, the self-interest of ordinary citizens. These real impediments to, quote, reinventing government, close quote, hit me smack in the head when subsequently, in the period of congressional trophy hunting and the actual shutdown of the federal government, I proposed, as then head of the U.S. Small Business Administration, an offensive defense of a 25% cut in our own budget. Congress, effectively the executive branch's board of directors, loved the idea. But to accomplish my goal, my proposal would have marginally raised fees paid by the banks that offer the SBA guaranteed loans. I would have closed some of our 106 offices, eliminated some of the jobs. By the time the bank lobbyists, local chambers of commerce, and agency employees' families had made their views known to Congress, we were left with the reduced budget, but no authority to make the proposed changes necessary for that rational plan. Sometimes in our checks and balances democracy, it's not Machiavelli, suspicion, or spin, but our own self-interests which are to blame for the ambush. With contemporary politics driven by spin, we have to ask, is the public adequately informed or sufficiently honest with themselves to render valid judgments on whether our government deserves our trust? Another war story. Soon after my appointment as deputy director at OMB, I accepted an invitation to speak about federal spending to the Rotary Club in my coastal South Carolina hometown. Many of these conservative, well-educated, prosperous neighbors were long-term friends who were ardent critics of government spending. When I asked the audience to indicate if they were the beneficiaries of any federal programs, not a single hand was raised. Then I asked how many of these Rotarians were recipients of military retirement benefits, and about one-third acknowledged the fact. I continued my questioning. About one-third had gone to college under the GI Bill. More than half had sons or daughters with government-backed college loans. SBA guaranteed loans? More than a dozen of our most respected local entrepreneurs. Medicare benefits? Of course. When I asked if any of their houses had federally backed hurricane and flood insurance, everyone vigorously nodded as if I were silly to ask. So for the next 20 minutes, I proceeded with a broad outline of our federal government's budget. And in conclusion, I asked once again, based on the presentation, how many of them thought of themselves as personally benefiting from a federal spending program? Not a single Rotarian raised his hand. Yet whoever said that in personal faith or in the secular world, trust is derived from rational analysis? Similarly, the public has an incontrovertible perception of the decline of ethics and morality of government leaders. And this attitude surely contributes to the deterioration of trust in government. The common suspicion is that most politicians serve their own re-election and personal interests above the public's. Well, whatever the truth in that, the spin is for challengers and even fixtures of the Capitol, like my late Senator Strom Thurmond, always to run for office as outsiders. Admittedly, incidents of professional impropriety and personal indiscretion, as well as the hypocrisy of some who render public judgments, fundamentally undermine trust in government. But in separate conversations, longtime Washington veterans, both Bob Dole, the former Republican leader of the Senate, and Tom Foley, the former Democratic Speaker of the House of Representatives, have insisted to me that the standard of ethics and morality in our nation's capital is far higher today than when they arrived as freshmen. Far more complex factors are at work. A collection of essays in Why People Don't Trust Government point also to the possible excessive growth in the scope of government and the lack of consensus about what a government should do, particularly about controversial objectives, such as, a random example, a preemptive military action. They point to unrealistic expectations from the gap between political reality and government reality. I mean, even our initiative was called Reinventing Government. Wars on poverty and drugs, a war on terror. They point to the citizens' sense of distance from government. While confidence in Congress has fallen as a whole, Congress as a whole, has fallen below 25%. More than half of Americans still have a favorable impression of their own congressman. They point to the loss of civil discourse, venomous conflict between political parties, wedge issues, negative campaigns. I can tell you from my own experience with the late Lee Atwater, negative campaigns work. They point to vehement partisanship. They point to contemporary media's focus on conflict over substance, and particularly television's preference for dramatic pictures over substance. If we're considering tonight and tomorrow a culture of suspicion and spin, this last factor's importance, in my opinion, can't be overstated. And Professor Gary Owen agrees. He notes that the eminent political scientist V.O. Key Jr., I quote from his book, writing about the U.S. media of the 1950s at the height of trust in government, lamented that the press had no longer interpreted politics for its audience. In a sense, V.O. Key wrote, the press has moved from the role of actor to that of narrator. Its content tended to reaffirm existing values, to buttress prevailing institutions, to support ancient ways of doing things, Key wrote. Professor Oren puts his finger on it. He writes, the press today has shed the role of reinforcing a pro-government consensus. No longer just a narrator, it is very much an actor in today's political drama, embracing authority-challenging values and conveying a steady stream of unambiguously negative cues about government and politics. In Key's term, Professor Oren observes, one might say that the press continues to reinforce the prevailing view, but this view has shifted from trust to mistrust of government. The consequence? What, as their book titles suggest, Australian art critic Robert Hughes calls the culture of complaint, and Georgetown linguistics professor Deborah Tannen considers the argument culture. And we can continue to debate whether journalists, seizing the sizzle and often neglecting the steak, created or simply reflect this culture of suspicion and spin. I have a hunch, based on a litany of experiences. One from my White House days still especially irritates me. We were considering helping the president consider potential nominees for the Supreme Court. And President Clinton insisted on reading their judicial opinions, their law review articles, their speeches, himself. This took considerable time, and his daily schedule, of course, was already overcrowded. But he wouldn't rely on the summaries or briefing memos from those of us assisting him. As the field narrowed, he just read more. Weeks went by. But there was no deadline. It's a life appointment. And you might think that this is precisely what a president, especially a Yale law graduate, should do on such an important matter. But the Washington press corps grew tired of waiting and reported night after night that this president just couldn't make a decision. One afternoon, after a confidential Oval Office discussion of several finalists' judicial philosophies, so that the president could refine his own impressions, a session in which the president's diligence, intellect, and deliberation would have impressed any thoughtful American. I walked down the 2 doors, the hallway to my West Wing office, and heard as I entered an arrogant TV network's White House correspondent scoff on air that, once again, in a meeting adjourned moments ago, President Clinton could not make a decision. Is it any wonder what the public thought? However much we regret the loss of trust in government, a measure of wariness, of course, is appropriate. And the First Amendment is clear that even at the cost of suspicion and spin, the media has the constitutional right to question and challenge government. That is precisely why I lament the inadequate media and consequently citizen attention devoted to what I believe to be our national political system's greatest breach of trust. Former Nixon administration Commerce Secretary Peter G. Peterson, who co-chaired with now Treasury Secretary John Snow a conference board commission on public trust and private enterprise, admonished us this year in his book, Running on Empty, I quote, "Republicans and Democrats alike have mortgaged America's future through reckless tax cuts, out-of-control spending, and Enron-style accounting in Congress. And the situation," he says, "will only get worse as the baby boom generation begins to retire." The Social Security and Medicare trust funds are indicative of the problem. And as others have said, since these are merely IOUs from the Treasury for current spending, the trust funds are neither funded nor trusted. I'm one of the oldest baby boomers, father of 2 teenagers, and I'm deeply disturbed, no, outraged, by mounting twin deficits, the once greatest creditor nation's new status as the world's largest debtor, America's consequent current addiction to foreign capital, and in Pete Peterson's words, the denial, distraction, and self-indulgence of both political parties. Partisan gridlock is routinely exploited by special interests, and campaigns of sizzle. Where's the steak? This muddle is real cause for loss of trust in government. Putting aside suspicion and spin, we everyday citizens shall have to demand change. Upon arriving in London as ambassador in 1997, I insisted that my family and I go straight from Heathrow Airport to Westminster Abbey to pay respects at the statue of the curious-looking William Wilberforce, my longtime hero in many ways. He's best remembered for championing the abolition of the slave trade. But his second cause, what he called the restoration of manners, is more relevant to 21st century America than it was even to 19th century England. In contemporary English, he was fighting for greater civility in public discourse. More steak, less sizzle. This is what my wife Linda and I have sought for 25 years at our Renaissance weekends, to bridge the gaps of religion, race, age, ideologies, to address serious issues with more light than heat, to celebrate the incredible transforming power of ideas and relationships, to encourage trust. This need not be obdurate trust, naive about human nature. We're all post-lapsarian creatures, I believe, from my years ago studies of theology, driven by our own self-interests. Lazarillo de Tormes' 16th century fable, read in my freshman year at college, helped shape this belief. You may know this story. This boy, accompanying a blind man, is told when they rest from their journey over a simple meal that they have to ration the few grapes they have. For every one grape the old man takes, the youth can take one himself. Hungry, and considering it a safe transgression, this picaresque character starts taking 2 or 3 grapes each time the blind man takes one? And then the blind man strikes him with his cane. What have I done wrong? You've been greedy and breached my trust. But how did you know? When I started taking 2 grapes, you never objected. William Temple, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, embraced us as we truly are when he wrote in Nature, God, and Man that government is the art of ordering life so that self-interest prompts what justice demands. In a culture of suspicion and spin, trust can best be restored in our boardrooms, amidst the competing claims of brands, in the public square, by enhanced transparency, by admission of self-interest, by confidence in the common wisdom of engaged, informed citizens. Notwithstanding the fears of Hamilton, other founding fathers, and Vance Packard, I trust the common wisdom. Many in the Academy share Thomas Carlyle's suspicion about what he called the collective wisdom of individual ignorance. And we're all familiar with that Scottish journalist Charles Mackay's 1841 chronicle, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. But I side with the thesis of a recent little book by James Surowiecki, The Wisdom of Crowds. That the many are smarter than the few. That if you put together a big enough and diverse enough group of people and ask them to make decisions affecting matters of general interest, that group's decision will, over time, be intellectually superior to the isolated individual, no matter how smart or well-informed he is. Citing examples ranging from computer simulations at Los Alamos, space shuttle missions, Navy efforts to locate a missing submarine, to Las Vegas bookmakers and Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, the author makes a compelling, though counterintuitive, case that trust on major decisions is better placed in a diverse group of people who possess varying degrees of knowledge and insight than in 1 or 2 people, no matter how smart those people are. You know the experiment, whereas a group guesses the number of jelly beans in a jar, the average of all the estimates is likely to be more accurate than any single bet. Picking stocks, betting on the Super Bowl, shaping public policy, it's unlikely that one person over time will do better than the group. Maybe there's wisdom and safeguard in the fact that Christianity has 26,000 denominations. How then is trust in the public square fortified? The crowd in our nation's public square, Robert Putnam's bowling alone generation of boomers and Generation Xers, Peterson's we first generation of senior citizens, the interest groups, the spinners, will act, we can be certain, in their self-interest. Trust requires transparency and accountability. Though the paperweight in my desk for more than 30 years reminds me to trust in the Lord, period, we're not called to a blind trust on matters secular. Government, corporate boards, and public markets can be trusted if, given transparency and accountability, they recognize and order self-interest in the way that prompts what the common good demands. The common good, however, must be determined by a big and diverse and generally informed crowd. This requires a renewal of civic engagement. Without it, trust cannot be restored. On this campus and elsewhere, I see encouraging signs. While we each struggle to center our personal lives in trust, we mustn't neglect restoration of trust in the public square. Or, drowned in a culture of suspicion and spin, have we simply given up on trust? Trust in business, trust in government, and now turned introspectively simply to matters of the heart. That's why there are two great steak and kidney pie dilemmas. After years of sampling pies with little steak and no kidney, we demand of our boards and our brands and our politicos the substance and transparency trust requires. Or, suspicious and despairing, is it simply not worth the effort? The other dilemma, even more fundamentally, will we give up on trust itself, retreat to the cloister and country club, and just be satisfied with getting as big a pie as we can for ourselves? Or will we become more engaged citizens, as shareholders, as consumers, as voters, and not relent until we get the steak and kidney we were promised and deserve? Essentially, can we earn back for our institutions the very trust we lament they have lost? For the opportunity to raise these questions with you tonight, I thank you very much.